Suffering from anxiety, pain, aching muscles, and poor circulation? A simple bath can fix this. Our herbal bath formula is known to correct these issues. Visit our store at www.blacksunrise.com/herbs page. Remember to spell sunrise SONRISE. Global Black Headline News. African American reinvents the food supply wheel using blockchain to power a successful company. Caribbean islands argue that the Organization of American States are involved in coups in Latin America and the Caribbean. South Africa boycotts the ENCA over racist accusations from Indian owner Pillay. EFF calls for nationwide boycotts. And in Aboriginal Australia, white woman claims to be a black Aboriginal Australian. Is this a colonial tactic to whiten black Australia? Join us today, GBF Headline News. We focus on the Organization of American States in the Caribbean and Latin America. You can find the article on blacksunrise.com. OAS and Elections in Bolivia and Dominica, Part 11. I'm going to read to you a couple of paragraphs from the article and then we'll break it down. When the OAS Electoral Observer Mission suddenly annulled the result of the Bolivia presidential vote last October and provided the fig leaf to depose and exile President Evo Morales, little did Secretary General Luis Almagro know that would be the beginning of the end of his crusade to turn the hemispheric organization into an electoral mechanism for delegitimization of targeted governments. Delegitimizing of targeted governments. The article goes on to state that salivating over their success in Bolivia, OAS, those crazed with using elections to remove elected socialist administrations in Latin America and the Caribbean, just 1 week later launched their next related electoral rescue mission. This time in Dominica. For those of you who don't know, Dominica is an island in the Caribbean. But look at this. Unlike Bolivia, it was never mission accomplished in Dominica, where Almagro had wrongly predicted the polls would not be free and fair without OAS involvement. So what the article is stating is that the Organization of American States successfully overthrew the Bolivian Evo Morales out of the government. And they were hoping to do the same thing in Dominica. And their proxy was the Secretary General Almagro to do this. However, they failed. But this is what occurred afterwards. His goal, however, had understandably inflamed CARICOM. So CARICOM is the Community of Caribbean Islands, much of what the African Union is trying to do with the AFCFTA agreement. CARICOM has an agreement within the Caribbean islands for security, trade, etc., etc. Okay, so his actions in Bolivia as Secretary General and his attempted actions in Dominica to influence the elections for the OAS ended up failing, but luckily for CARICOM leaders, they were able to see that he was influencing the elections across Latin America and was hoping to overthrow governments in the Caribbean. Now are you guys beginning to understand why it's so difficult for Black countries to get their head up, or Latin American countries to literally get their head up above water? Because you have to think about domestic organizations that are there that are working with international organizations that are trying to sway the politics and sway the economy in favor of outside forces. Then you have international organizations that are in the country that are also trying to influence elections in favor of external forces. Then you have multilateral organizations such as the OAS, which works with countries in the Americas, but electing the wrong head into office, that person could be bribed and that person can literally be working to dismantle elected government officials. Okay, so the article goes on to say Skerritt was sworn in earlier this week for a record fourth consecutive term, and Dominica will once again be able to continue building the world's first climate resilient land following successive hurricanes that devastated the island. But the CARICOM group is naturally annoyed at the brazen way in which Almagro has behaved since assuming the position of the OAS. He basically turned it, they are arguing that he used his position as Secretary General of the OAS to basically do the bidding of Washington. And that bidding was to literally influence the electoral process in Latin American countries and the Caribbean countries to overthrow non-democratic governments. So any government that didn't have an American democratic model, he was put in as a stooge to steer the election away from electing a socialist government or to overthrow a non-democratic leader. So immediately after the election dust settles in Dominica, Vincentian Prime Minister Dr. Ralph Gonzalez launched a bid by CARICOM to vote Almagro out of his post. However, while most expecting CARICOM to recommend a Caribbean candidate from within, the Prime Ministers of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Antigua and Barbuda, earlier this week jointly announced CARICOM's nomination of a respected former Salvadoran diplomat who also served as President of the United States General Assembly. So this is what's taking place here. Almagro will be standing for re-election, and Peru's ambassador to the USA is also a candidate. Under President Donald Trump, Washington has repeatedly demonstrated its willingness to go to abnormal lengths to pursue its policies and targets, whether it's Venezuela, Iran, Bolivia, Cuba, or Nicaragua. The article is stating that Trump took his fight against Venezuela directly to the Caribbean last March, and he used his Mar-a-Lago summit to split the Caribbean group at the OAS by targeting 5 leaders. Those 5 countries were the Bahamas, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Jamaica, and St. Lucia. In return, he promised them investments and security assistance in return for supporting his anti-Maduro Venezuelan policy. Now, why is this a bad thing? Again, the Caribbean votes as a bloc, and this is why on Black Sunrise, we don't just focus on news in one region. We try to literally bring you good news and bad news all over the planet. Why is this important? Because we can't make any headway if one group of Black people are succeeding and the 90% of us are failing. So why is this a bad thing? Literally, this policy split the Caribbean in 2. And as you know, the Caribbean is 90% Black countries. So it literally split the Caribbean in 2 for a quid pro quo. If you go against Venezuela, which is an independent country that elected Maduro, and side with the United States in getting him out, you will receive favors in terms of investment and security by the United States government. Here's what happened as a result. That split, now the Caribbean is literally parted in 2. Those who are siding with the US, those who are not siding with the US. Here's the problem with this. Trinidad and Tobago is literally located 8 miles from Venezuela. Trinidad and Tobago is the largest economy in the Caribbean, and it's very stable in terms of its natural gas production. It's politically stable, it's economically stable. It's literally 8 miles from Venezuela. U.S. interference into Venezuela will literally impact Trinidad in terms of their oil and gas reserves, in terms of the influx of refugees leaving Venezuela, coming into Trinidad, and in terms of the southern border being porous to other criminal elements wanting to come into Trinidad due to the instability going on in Venezuela. What's also important for you to know is that Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela also share a very large oil and gas basin. In fact, one of the largest in the Caribbean. And they just negotiated an agreement where they can share those oil reserves. Now, get this. That split was registered in the first sets of votes on Venezuela at the OAS, where all 5 Caribbean states represented at Trump's Mar-a-Lago voted to back U.S.-backed positions against Venezuela, including recognition of an opposition appointee to represent Venezuela after Caracas pulled out in February 1919. Now, how is this bad for African countries, black countries in the Caribbean? Okay, the article goes on to say that CARICOM would be naive to believe that Trump will let Almagro, his chief gladiator at the OAS, go down without a fight. America usually backs their man. But what types of ramifications can this have? In short, the Caribbean now is split, whereas they traded as a bloc, voted as a bloc, had agreements as a bloc, spoke as a bloc. This divide and conquer tactic, it through the OAS by the election of Almagro, now splits the Caribbean in two. You're literally going to have infighting over American resources to so-called economies that are in need of those resources. At the same time, the southern tip of the Caribbean can now become destabilized because once Venezuela is destabilized through American intervention, Trinidad and Tobago's economy may falter or may become destabilized if they cannot manage a large refugee crisis. And the position of the government of Trinidad and Tobago is very clear. They do not want to meddle in Venezuela's business because they are a sovereign state. So these are some of the risks right now with the decision of Almagro. Now, finally, the article goes on to say that Almagro knows Washington has his back, so the Caribbean will do well to watch its own between now and the OAS election, which will be more than just an electoral mission. Again, when we try to understand, and this is why we're doing Global Black News, both good and both bad, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Good, bad, ugly, and the beauty. Beautiful, right? When you're trying to understand why there's a large group of people at your southern border, and the answer that the U.S. government takes is to build a wall and keep them out, as opposed to the position where you don't go in and overthrow their governments. Why is there high crime in the Caribbean? The article states that part of the problem with these interventionist tactics, and again, you can read the article at blacksunrise.com, is that these interventions destabilizes countries. When the countries are destabilized, guns and drugs are then funneled into these countries, and their economies tank. So again, when you want to understand why is it that a large group of people of the Caribbean may be coming to the United States, it's because their countries are being politically and economically influenced by much larger countries. Elected governments are being overthrown. Militia groups are being planted in those countries to attack the duly elected government and overthrow them, causing local instability, regional instability, national instability. So one move by Mr. Almagro caused Bolivia to literally erupt. But that's not all. The second part is Venezuela. It's literally causing Venezuela to be destabilized. And next door to Venezuela is the strongest economy in the Caribbean. 8 miles from Venezuela is Trinidad and Tobago. So again, we look at political interferences, economic interferences into these countries. You have to say to yourself, these countries aren't failing because the governments are no good. You must understand that nationally, locally, regionally, domestically, and internationally, there are organizations, and within those organizations, there are people who are strategically put into those organizations to carry out missions for foreign governments that does not benefit the local governments. Join us for more Black news, more global Black news at www.blacksunrise.com. Sunrise is SONRISE.